At some point within the next 10 years, a small crew of astronauts will likely climb aboard a spacecraft headed toward Mars, knowing that even if every single piece of hardware performs flawlessly, their own bodies might end up being the biggest obstacle to ever making it back to Earth. This isn't science fiction speculation. It's a real, actively researched concern discussed in peer-reviewed medical journals and official NASA mission planning documents. And the deeper scientists dig into this problem, the clearer it becomes that the greatest challenge facing a Mars mission isn't mechanical at all. It's biological. Building the rocket is largely a solved problem. NASA, SpaceX, and other organizations have already proven most of the individual technologies a Mars mission would require, from heavy lift launch vehicles to life support systems capable of running for years without resupply. What remains genuinely unsolved is what nearly 3 years away from Earth actually does to the human body, and whether that body, once fundamentally altered, can ever safely function under Earth's gravity again. To understand why this mission is so different from anything humanity has previously attempted, start with the raw numbers. The Apollo missions reached the moon in roughly 3 days, covering about 250,000 miles, still comfortably within Earth's gravitational neighborhood, with some realistic possibility of abort or rescue for much of the trip. Mars represents an entirely different scale of challenge. At its closest approach, Mars sits somewhere between 55 and 60 million kilometers from Earth, but spacecraft using current chemical propulsion can't simply travel in a straight line to reach it. Instead, missions follow a curved transfer orbit that takes advantage of both planets' motion around the Sun, stretching the effective travel distance considerably and resulting in a one-way transit time somewhere between 6 and 9 months, depending on the specific trajectory chosen and how much fuel a mission is willing to spend shortening it. The return journey isn't simply a mirror image of the outbound trip. This is actually where the mission's true length comes from. Earth and Mars only align favorably for an efficient return, roughly once every 26 months, a rhythm astronomers call the synodic period, dictated by the different lengths of each planet's orbit. This means a crew can't simply finish their scientific work and turn around immediately. They have to wait on the Martian surface until the planets swing back into a workable alignment, typically a wait of around 500 days. Add that surface stay to the outbound and return transit times, and a complete round-trip mission works out to somewhere between 2 and 3 years total. The overwhelming majority of it spent either in the emptiness of deep space or living under gravity roughly a third as strong as Earth's, on a planet without a breathable atmosphere. Throughout all of this, real-time conversation with Earth simply isn't possible, because the distance between the two planets is constantly changing as they orbit the Sun at different speeds. So is the radio delay. At its closest, a signal takes about 3 minutes to cross the gap. At its farthest, when Mars sits on the opposite side of the Sun, that delay stretches past 20 minutes each way, meaning a simple question and answer exchange can take over 40 minutes to complete. There's no scenario where mission control talks an astronaut through an emergency in real time. Every message becomes a delayed transmission, sent and then waited on, with no ability to interrupt or respond quickly if something starts going wrong. And if something does go wrong, there is no rescue mission standing by. The nearest fully equipped hospital is, for all practical purposes, months away in either direction. As dramatic as the distance and isolation genuinely are, the real story here is what happens inside the human body during a journey like this. A Mars mission forces the body through 3 completely different gravitational environments back to back, each demanding its own kind of physical adaptation, with essentially no recovery period built in between any of them. First comes 6 to 9 months of true weightlessness during the outbound flight. Then comes an extended stay on the Martian surface, where gravity measures only about 38% of Earth's. It's enough to feel like something, but nowhere near enough to properly exercise a body that evolved under full Earth gravity. Then, if a return is even attempted, comes another 6 to 9 months of weightlessness on the flight home, followed by a sudden, jarring reintroduction to full Earth gravity after years spent almost entirely without it. Scientists already have a fairly detailed picture of what each of these transitions does to the body individually, largely thanks to decades of research aboard the International Space Station. What remains far less certain is what happens when a single human body gets pushed through all 3 of these transitions consecutively. Over a period of years, rather than the roughly 6-month missions most existing research is actually based on, The most immediately dangerous threat astronauts face is one they cannot see, feel, or defend against in any practical way: deep space radiation. Here on Earth, we're protected from the vast majority of it by two overlapping shields: our planet's magnetic field, which deflects charged particles away, and our atmosphere, which absorbs much of what actually gets through. Astronauts traveling to Mars lose both of these protections almost entirely. NASA got its first genuinely direct measurement of this danger, not from a human volunteer, but from an instrument riding inside the Curiosity rover during its actual journey to Mars between 2011 and 2012. A detector called the Radiation Assessment Detector, positioned roughly where a human crew compartment would sit, recorded a dose rate during the roughly 8-month cruise phase equivalent to about 1.8 millisieverts per day, adding up to approximately 300 millisieverts for that single leg of the journey. Once on the Martian surface, the dose rate dropped somewhat, since the planet's thin atmosphere provides limited shielding, averaging roughly 2/3 of a millisievert per day. Taken together, a full mission profile involving a 180-day outbound flight, an extended 500-day stay on Mars, and a 180-day return flight adds up to a cumulative dose of approximately 1.01 sieverts, according to the research team's published analysis in the journal Science. To put that figure into perspective, NASA currently limits astronaut career radiation exposure to roughly 600 millisieverts of effective dose, a threshold designed to keep an individual's added lifetime risk of fatal cancer below about 3%. A single Mars mission, based on actual measured Curiosity data, would push an astronaut to nearly double their entire career limit in one trip alone. For comparison, an astronaut spending 6 months aboard the International Space Station, still protected by Earth's magnetic field even at orbital altitude, typically absorbs somewhere between 50 and 100 millisieverts total, meaning a Mars mission could expose a crew member to roughly 10 times more radiation than an equivalent stay in low Earth orbit. This particular danger doesn't respond well to obvious solutions either. The most damaging component of deep space radiation, galactic cosmic rays, consists of extremely high-energy particles that pass straight through modest shielding, largely unaffected. Thick, heavy shielding can actually make the problem worse in certain configurations, because these particles collide with shielding material and produce a cascade of secondary radiation, sometimes called a spallation effect, that can be nearly as dangerous as the radiation it was meant to stop. The long-term health consequences associated with this level of exposure are genuinely severe. Meaningfully elevated lifetime cancer risk, accelerated cardiovascular aging, and blood vessel damage. Documented cognitive effects, including impaired memory and slower decision-making, observed in animal studies exposed to simulated cosmic ray radiation. And an increased likelihood of early cataracts. It's a pattern already observed to a lesser degree among astronauts who've flown multiple long-duration missions in low Earth orbit. While radiation causes damage largely invisibly, something equally dramatic and far better documented happens simultaneously to an astronaut's skeleton and muscles. This is where the science shifts from theoretical risk to consistently measured fact. The human body is essentially calibrated for constant resistance against Earth's gravity. Every step, every time you stand up, every ordinary movement throughout the day signals to your bones and muscles that they're needed, and that constant signal is exactly what keeps them strong. Remove that load, and the body responds by treating bone and muscle as expendable. Decades of research aboard Mir and the International Space Station have established this pattern with real precision. Even with a rigorous exercise program, roughly 2.5 hours of resistance, and cardiovascular training 6 days a week, astronauts still lose bone mineral density at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per month in weight-bearing regions like the hip, spine, and pelvis, exactly the structures needed to stand, walk, and absorb impact on Earth. Without that daily exercise routine, historical data from earlier space stations recorded losses climbing even higher, in some cases exceeding 2% per month at certain skeletal sites. Extrapolate a rate like that across the roughly 30 months of combined weightlessness and reduced Martian gravity involved in a full mission. And researchers have calculated the resulting bone loss could plausibly fall somewhere between 30 and 60% of original bone density if countermeasures prove only partially effective over that duration. An outcome NASA's own musculoskeletal researchers describe as a genuinely serious unsolved problem for mission planning. To make that number tangible, a postmenopausal woman with clinically diagnosed osteoporosis on Earth typically loses somewhere around 30 to 40% of her peak bone mass, usually over a decade or more of gradual decline. An astronaut returning from a full-length Mars mission could plausibly experience bone loss in that same range, or worse, compressed into roughly 2.5 years instead of 10. Recovery back on Earth is neither quick nor guaranteed to be complete. A 2022 study, published in Scientific Reports, followed astronauts for a full year after returning from long-duration spaceflight and found that those who had flown missions longer than 6 months showed key measures of bone strength and density at the tibia remaining, meaningfully below their pre-flight baseline even after 12 full months back on Earth, with longer missions consistently associated with poorer recovery. Muscle tissue follows a strikingly similar pattern, and for many of the same underlying reasons. Without gravity to work against, muscles that once handled the ordinary work of standing and walking begin losing mass and strength within just a few weeks. With documented losses of 10 to 20% of muscle mass on missions of only a few months, even with regular in-flight exercise, the muscles most affected tend to be exactly the ones that matter most for walking and standing afterward: the legs, lower back, and core. At the cellular level, muscle fiber composition also shifts away from the slow, fatigue-resistant type the body normally relies on for sustained everyday activity, toward faster fiber types built for short bursts of effort, but poorly suited to the continuous exertion ordinary life on Earth actually requires. Astronauts returning from 6-month ISS missions frequently describe genuinely basic tasks: climbing a single flight of stairs, standing for an extended period, as unexpectedly exhausting in the weeks immediately following their return, despite having exercised diligently throughout the mission. Joints and connective tissue aren't spared either. Without regular mechanical loading, cartilage, which normally cushions the space between bones, gradually thins, a change associated with elevated long-term risk of joint problems and early arthritis, occasionally even in astronauts who are otherwise still relatively young. The cardiovascular system undergoes its own quiet but significant transformation, one that arguably matters more for a safe return to Earth than any other single change. On Earth, your heart constantly works against gravity to push blood upward toward your head and upper body, a task that essentially doesn't exist the same way in weightlessness, where fluid distributes far more evenly throughout the body. Research led by cardiologist Benjamin Levine has documented that astronaut hearts on long-duration missions don't simply weaken. They actually change shape, becoming measurably more spherical rather than retaining their normal, elongated form. Structural adaptation to no longer needing to generate strong directional pressure against gravity. At the same time, roughly 1 liter or more of blood plasma that would normally pool in the legs on Earth instead shifts upward toward the head and chest, producing the puffy face and noticeably thinner legs. Astronauts often develop an orbit, an effect crews have informally nicknamed bird legs. Sensing what it interprets as excess fluid in the upper body, the body responds by reducing total blood volume, sometimes by 10 to 20%, a genuinely significant adjustment. The real consequence of all this only shows up once gravity returns. Astronauts stepping off a 6-month ISS mission frequently experience what's clinically called orthostatic intolerance, a sudden inability to maintain healthy blood pressure while simply standing upright. It's causing dizziness, a racing heart, and in some documented cases, actual fainting. This happens because a heart and circulatory system adapted to months of weightlessness suddenly has to fight gravity again with reduced blood volume and an altered, less efficient shape. After a mission stretching 2 to 3 years rather than 6 months, with an added stop at only 38% gravity sandwiched between 2 full weightless phases, the honest scientific answer is that nobody knows with certainty how severe this effect would become, because no human has ever actually experienced that specific sequence. What existing research strongly suggests is that the underlying mechanism would only be amplified by a longer, more complex mission profile, not lessened by it. There's a related complication tied directly to bone loss worth understanding on its own, because it introduces an entirely different kind of medical emergency into a mission where evacuation genuinely isn't an option. As bone breaks down faster than the body can rebuild it in microgravity, the calcium released from that degraded bone doesn't simply disappear. It enters the bloodstream and eventually gets filtered out through the kidneys, dramatically raising calcium concentration in an astronaut's urine throughout the mission. That elevated calcium load significantly increases the risk of kidney stones, a condition that's uncomfortable but manageable on Earth with pain medication and same-day hospital access, but which becomes a genuinely serious medical crisis on a spacecraft or Martian outpost, months away from any surgical facility. NASA has already documented kidney stone risk as a real elevated concern, even on standard 6-month ISS rotations, and mission planners specifically flag it as one of the more mundane-sounding but genuinely mission-threatening risks a Mars crew would face. Vision presents its own distinct, well-documented problem, one NASA didn't fully appreciate until multiple long-duration astronauts began independently reporting it. The same upward fluid shift responsible for puffy faces in orbit also increases pressure inside the skull, and that added pressure can physically flatten the back of the eyeball and cause swelling of the optic nerve, a condition NASA now formally calls spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. Studies examining astronauts after long-duration ISS missions have found measurable structural changes to the eye in a substantial share of long-duration crew members, changes that in some cases have persisted for years after return to Earth, and in a smaller number of cases appear to be entirely permanent. It remains one of the least understood risks in the entire field, one a multi-year Mars mission would expose astronauts to for far longer than any current ISS assignment. One of the clearest windows into all of this comes from a genuinely unique piece of research, a NASA's twins study published in 2019. Astronaut Scott Kelly spent nearly a full year aboard the International Space Station, while his identical twin brother, retired astronaut Mark Kelly, remained on Earth the entire time, giving researchers an almost perfect natural experiment. Two genetically identical bodies, one exposed to long-duration spaceflight and one not. The results were extensive and in places genuinely surprising. Scott's telomeres, protective caps at the ends of chromosomes that typically shorten with age and stress, actually lengthened during his time in orbit. An unexpected finding researchers are still working to fully explain, only to rapidly shorten again within days of his return to Earth, snapping back toward, and in some measures past, his pre-flight baseline. Researchers also documented measurable changes in gene expression tied to immune function, DNA repair, and bone formation, along with a temporary but real decline in cognitive speed and accuracy on certain tests performed shortly after his return, changes that mostly, though not entirely, resolved within the following months. The twins' study only covered a single year in low Earth orbit, still shielded to some degree by Earth's magnetic field. And researchers involved were careful to note its findings can't simply be scaled up to predict what a multi-year Mars mission would do, but it remains the single best-controlled dataset humanity has for understanding how spaceflight reshapes the human body at the genetic and cellular level, and virtually every effect it documented pointed in the same direction, toward change that was significant, only partially reversible, and directly tied to how long the exposure lasted. There's a psychological dimension to all of this too, one that receives less attention than bone density statistics, but that NASA takes seriously enough to fund dedicated research programs around. Confined for years inside a small spacecraft and later a Martian habitat, with communication delays making real-time contact with friends and family genuinely impossible, and with rescue simply off the table if something goes wrong, a Mars crew would face a form of extended isolation with essentially no precedent in human spaceflight history. NASA has studied related conditions using ground-based isolation facilities, including a habitat called Hera at Johnson Space Center, where volunteer crews spend weeks or months sealed inside Mars mission analog conditions, specifically to study how confinement, restricted communication, and simulated mission stress affect sleep, mood, team cohesion, and decision-making. Arctic research stations offer another useful, if imperfect, comparison, since crews wintering over in isolated stations face months of confinement with limited outside contact, and researchers have documented real patterns there, including a well-known dip in morale once a mission passes its midpoint but remains far from over, sometimes called the third quarter phenomenon. None of these analogs perfectly replicates a Mars mission's specific combination of physical danger, communication delay, and genuine irreversibility, and it remains a genuinely open question how a crew would fare psychologically across a full 2 to 3 year mission with no real possibility of an early return home. Given all of this, it's worth being precise about what scientists are actually saying, because the honest version of this story is more nuanced, and in some ways more unsettling, than a flat claim that nobody could ever physically return from Mars. NASA. ESA and independent researchers studying this problem aren't asserting that returning is a strict biological impossibility the way faster-than-light travel is a strict physical impossibility. What they're saying is that returning safely without catastrophic and likely permanent damage to the crew's cardiovascular system, skeleton, and possibly cognitive function isn't something current technology and current medical countermeasures can currently guarantee, particularly for a mission stretching into the 2 to 3 year range this profile demands. A body that has spent years in weightlessness and reduced gravity, its bones porous, its heart reshaped and deconditioned, its blood volume reduced, would face a landing on Earth in a severely weakened state, and meaningfully elevated risk of bone fracture from something as simple as standing up too quickly, and at real risk of the heart itself struggling to pump blood against full Earth's gravity after years without needing to. Whether that qualifies as never coming home again, or simply as an extraordinarily dangerous homecoming current medicine can't yet make safe, is genuinely a matter of definition, and reasonable scientists studying the problem land on different sides of exactly how to phrase it. None of this means researchers are simply watching these problems unfold without trying to intervene. Alongside daily exercise, scientists have spent years testing pharmaceutical countermeasures, originally developed for osteoporosis patients on Earth, including a class of drugs called bisphosphonates, which slow the rate at which the body breaks down bone. Early trials combining these drugs with the standard ISS exercise regimen have shown real promise in reducing bone loss beyond what exercise alone achieves. Similar research is underway into drugs that target muscle wasting directly, including compounds that block a protein called myostatin, which normally limits muscle growth. None of these interventions currently eliminate the underlying problem, and none have been tested across anything close to the multi-year timescale a Mars mission would actually involve, but they represent a genuinely active area of research rather than a problem scientists have simply resigned themselves to. There's also at least one proposed engineering solution that could meaningfully change this entire equation, and it's worth understanding why it hasn't been built yet. Artificial gravity, generated by slowly rotating part or all of a spacecraft to create centrifugal force mimicking real gravity, has been a serious subject of engineering study since at least the 1960s. In theory, a rotating Mars transit vehicle could allow a crew to experience something approximating Earth or Martian gravity for most of the outbound and return journey, potentially preventing the majority of the bone, muscle, and cardiovascular deterioration described here almost entirely. The physics behind the concept is well understood and not seriously disputed. The obstacle is almost entirely practical. Engineering a spacecraft large enough to rotate at a comfortable, non-nauseating speed while producing a meaningful fraction of Earth's gravity requires either a very large rotating radius or careful design trade-offs that most current spacecraft simply aren't built to accommodate, and no crewed rotating spacecraft of that kind has ever actually been constructed or tested in flight. NASA and other agencies continue studying the concept seriously, including ongoing research into partial gravity effects using shorter radius centrifuges. But every mission architecture actually being planned for a crewed Mars mission in the coming decade currently assumes a standard non-rotate, canting to a state it meant, to made a state of mummic selding. Empime de bane to mame, it's bame, is it a bam, in ba rin brain, at protected to and semantic stuff away from aman oisen for so our to have was I quit away with a ja to radiate or fell support I would apparatus to assist right away could it just it over to with that it's in this day somewhere the same meaning the full weightlessness problem described throughout this video remains, for now, the reality any near-term Mars crew would actually face. There's a useful way to hold all of these individual findings together rather than treating them as a scattered list of separate problems. Every system described here, the skeleton, the muscles, the heart, the eyes, the immune response documented in the twin study, responds to the exact same underlying trigger, The sudden removal of a mechanical and gravitational environment that human physiology spent hundreds of thousands of years quietly calibrating itself around. None of these changes are exotic diseases introduced by space itself. They're simply what an already well-understood biological system does when the one constant force it evolved around disappears for years at a time. That's precisely what makes this problem so difficult to simply engineer around with a clever gadget or a single new material. It isn't one point of failure. It's dozens of interconnected systems all quietly deteriorating together at different rates for the same underlying reason. All of which leads to a genuinely strange, almost unprecedented position the first Mars astronauts may find themselves in. Every previous form of human exploration in history, however dangerous, has generally assumed a return trip was the eventual goal, even when the odds along the way were grim. A Mars mission, based on everything current medicine understands about the human body's response to years of altered gravity and radiation exposure, might be the first form of exploration in history where the destination itself is functionally safer to remain on than the return trip is to attempt. Whether the first crews to reach Mars actually choose or are advised to stay rather than risk the physiological toll of coming home is a decision that hasn't been made yet. It depends heavily on how quickly countermeasures, from better radiation shielding to artificial gravity to improved exercise and pharmaceutical interventions, already being tested on the ISS, actually mature in the years before any real mission launches. The underlying science driving that decision isn't speculative fiction dressed up as documentary. It's the direct, measured, repeatedly replicated result of everything researchers have learned from 6 decades of watching what happens to the human body every single time it leaves the one planet it evolved to survive on.